Okay, Michael, first to you. Tell me, I'd love to know, who was your favorite minister and why was he or she so effective?
Oh, well, you start with a nice, easy one. Um, People who are looking for sort of tell-all stories and anecdotes, in the book are not going to find them. I basically anonymized a composite picture of lots and lots of ministers over the years. I started going to cabinet committees in 1987, and I saw cabinet up close under a number of ministers. But since you ask, I mean, the question invites a distinction that many people in the audience will recognize. Ministers, can be good to work with and pleasant and enjoyable company and the kind of person you'd like to go for a beer with after a long day, and completely ineffective. And there are ministers that are very effective that, can be very unpleasant. The ideal combination is somebody that you get along with and that you can work with, but also moves things forward and is able to be effective inside the cabinet room and in different aspects of the job. So, present company, excluded. I particularly enjoyed working with people of very different characters and personalities. There's very little in common with the collection that I spent a lot of time with, from Sheila Copps through to Jim Prentice to Bernard Valcourt and others. I really enjoyed working with Jim Prentice and miss him greatly, probably because he was my first as a full deputy, and my first exposure to that particular relationship between a deputy minister and a very effective and powerful cabinet minister.
So in a sense, were your experiences with these ministers, and let's say Mr. Prentice particularly, a bit of a template for the book?
What I try to capture is that their ministers and prime ministers are so diverse. They come in different kinds of temperaments, different go-to behaviors, different ways of learning, different ways of coming to decisions, and so on. And the book is an effort to extract, as best I can, some of the common elements about being effective as a minister. Being effective as a prime minister is another chapter in the book. And how senior public servants, need to adapt to the minister or the prime minister that they've got.
So I must admit, when I read it, you have, as you say, chapters on advice to the prime minister, advice to the deputy, advice to ministers. And as you say, of course, it's advice on how to govern. But when I read it, it seems so much of this is about how to get ahead, how to increase your influence, and in short, how to win. Like, what does this tell us about this whole notion of the nobility of public service against the cut and thrust of agenda setting and influence?
Well, the purpose of governing is to take decisions on our behalf in a democracy. We choose the 338 members of parliament once in a while. About somewhere between 25 and 40 of them get to sit around the cabinet table, and cabinet's not there to be a campus debating club or it's there to take decisions, often very complicated and hard decisions. And so what I try to focus on is shed some light on what it's like in the cabinet room, and what it is that ministers and prime ministers do all day. Most Canadians and most public servants, what they see are little snippets, a little bit of the 45-minute question period, maybe 3 minutes of that will show up on the news in the evening and so on. But ministers are busy all day, every day of the week, from the day they start to the day they leave. And I wanted to get across some of what their world looks like.
But you do play it very much, don't you, as a game of, to repeat, getting ahead and winning. You talk about the solar system revolving around the PM and how that changes or adapts, I guess. Like, what about the politicians who join for ideas, And because, do you remember Andrew Coyne wrote a piece that there were kind of two types of politicians, right? Those who want to run things and enjoy power, and those who care about ideas and want to make things happen. And I get it, it's kind of a simple typology, but you seem to be speaking to those who want to run power, have power and run it successfully. What about the others?
Well, at the end, both types want to have impact and influence and change the trajectory of decisions. So whether whatever your motivation is coming in for it, I'm really focused on effectiveness in getting cabinet government to move forward and take the decisions. Whether you're an idealist, an ideologue, or a pragmatist, at the end of the day, governing is about taking decisions.
So what advice would you give to that single issue politician or that politician who's joined for ideas? Simply get tougher?
No, I think what you need to do is be effective within the context of the team. In our system, you're not an independent senator like Bernie Sanders or Josh Hawley with an independent power base, trying to influence things from your office. You're a member of a caucus, of presumably 100 to 150 colleague MPs on the same political team. And your interests, are shared with the rest of the team. And if you're a cabinet minister, you're part of a collective group that, that's moving decisions on behalf of the whole government. So effective ministers are the ones that are persuasive with their colleagues.
Okay. Could I ask people if they're interested in putting in questions? Don't be shy. We will pick them and use them throughout a little later in this event. Let me go to a slightly different place. As you well know, Donald Savoy and others have argued that PMO is much too much power and that cabinet members are being marginalized and not really being allowed to play their proper roles as elected representatives. Do you agree with that?
No, I mean, I think there is a trope out there, a kind of narrative which is spread, by academics and journalists and others, that cabinet is very much a top-down exercise. Even very recently, people have used words like blind obedience and so on. There's no question the Prime Minister has the most influence. He or she is the prime. And, parties should be very thoughtful about who they choose as the leader, and Canadians should be very thoughtful about who they decide is going to be the Prime Minister. They do have a lot of influence as the leader of any team would, whether, in any walk of life. But I think what Canadians don't get to see because of cabinet secrecy and it's, behind caucus secrecy, is it's a very dynamic back and forth and give and take. And there is an opportunity, to make arguments and persuade people, talk people into things that they might otherwise not want to do, and talk them, out of things that they were headed for. And I've seen it happen many times at the cabinet table. So yes, it's those channels, which are often caricatured as a kind of command and control, Star Wars drones taking, orders from the emperor. They do have a degree of coordination of the whole team, but every one of them is also an opportunity to persuade the so-called center to change direction.
So where does that leave PMO?
PMO has a very important job, as does the Privy Council office, because the Prime Minister is the center of cabinet government, is the leader of the country in international affairs, is the leader, First Minister in the Federation with premiers and other levels of government. So, of course, the Prime Minister has a prime role in government, and the support system, both on the political side and the public service side, is hugely important. But there are dozens and dozens of issues, hundreds of decisions to be taken every year. The federal system has about 300 entities in it, grouped under about 30 to 35 ministers for accountability to Parliament, and coordinating all of that and moving it in the right direction to fulfill the mandate Canadians just gave the government in an election a few weeks ago, is a very necessary role. As I say, it is Westminster government. The decisions ultimately are taken by cabinet and then by Parliament. So of course there's a need for coordination. And frankly, the group of ministers, they're stronger and weaker, more persuasive, more or less persuasive. People that are better at the job than others. And prime ministers will always want to lead the team. That's their job in our system. Some of them do it with a heavier hand and style, and some with a lighter touch. But they're always going to be the leader.
Have you ever seen a style that hasn't worked?
I think every style works in the sense that people will adapt to the prime minister. if you see what I mean. So at the end, the test is going to be made by Canadians in elections from time to time, and perhaps someday by historians about what did you get done during the years that you had stewardship.
What you described as the role of PMO, I would have thought would have been the Privy Council office, but I guess you're saying it does the political coordination of all these various organizations. Is that a fair way of putting it?
I use the metaphor of a triangle a lot. People have heard this before, whether it's a minister being supported by a departmental deputy and a chief of staff, or the prime minister supported by the prime minister's political office and the Privy Council office. There will be, support from, from the political side, which and from the public service side, and getting them aligned so that each is doing the things that they are best at, and not sort of crossing over swim lanes into the other side's business, is part of the, the tradecraft of governing, if I can put it that way. Doesn't always work. Sometimes it gets out of balance. The public service tries to be too political, or the political side tries to run the department. But when you get the triangle balanced, ministers can get a lot done.
I want to ask you about conventions, because you write that conventions constrain the prime minister's decision making, but you also note that there's a discussion that conventions are being eroded, but you don't go any further. So tell me, do you think conventions are being eroded in this or any other area? Because of course, everyone will know conventions are critical to our system. And if they are, does it matter?
Well, a lot of the software of Canadian democracy is inherited from the British Westminster system, and it isn't coded and written down in statute or constitution. More of it is here than Britain. And one of the things I try to get across is that our variant, the C variant of democracy, is different than the UK and different than the United States and so on. And we have a unique model here. And I hope some of that comes across. And conventions are immensely important. I guess where I agree with Ian Brodie, who's written about this in a more rigorous way, is this sort of trope that the prime minister is all powerful and there's no resistance or checks and balances is a caricature, and it's just not the reality.
In your book, you reference Parliament, and you use the phrase the theater of answerability, which to me would seem to trivialize the concept. Is that what you meant?
No, not at all. It's a very serious business. I've been deliberately misquoted on this over the last couple of weeks. I want to be very clear that the feedback loop of a vigilant media, of Parliament, of the offices of Parliament is a key to effective governance, and it's really important. I write about it from the perspective of a minister, and how to stay out of trouble and how to be effective. That's not denigrating the role that those other actors play in our system. I do think there's an element of show and theater to it. I mean, that's an obvious statement. If you've ever watched Question Period, or if you've been to a parliamentary committee, you know that some of it's for the cameras.
I want to change gears then, if I could, and talk a little bit about your advice you give to deputy heads. You say that the main task, and I'm quoting here, of a deputy minister is to establish a solid working relationship with the minister. Mm-hmm. You make kind of no reference to policy development here. And it struck me that throughout the book, it really was notably absent as a role. You didn't allude to it much, and yet it would seem to me that the policy development and of course implementation is really what government's all about. Have I got it wrong?
Well, most of government is actually in delivery, service, and operations. Of the 260,000 public servants, that's what most people come in and do every day, and do it extremely well. The point I try to get across is that the main drivers of policy come from democratic politics. That's not a denigration of the public services role, but a basic choice about we're going to have a carbon price or we're not. We're going to have medical assistance in dying or not. We're going to legalize cannabis or not. We're going to have childcare of this form or another. These are settled in elections, election platforms that come from politics. There are dozens and dozens of sources of ideas for policy, from think tanks like yours to universities, academics, stakeholders, lobbyists, international experience. There's an abundant supply of policy ideas. My view on the role of the public service, in the sense of what can the public service do that nobody else can do, is take all of that noise and turn it into actionable choices, for a table of ministers.
But you know that your list of where policy ideas come from, a lot of them come from the public service and feed up, don't they?
I think that they're in the zone. A lot of what the policy shops do in government is to some extent apply a long-term radar to things that are emerging, and that's very valuable. The changing nature of work, the impact of artificial intelligence, what's happening with the rise of China. So that scanning and intelligence function, and is helpful, because it anticipates the kinds of choices that a cabinet table might face a year or 2 or 3 from now. But at the end of the day, it's still to a purpose, which is, what are the actionable choices for governments? Most of the value add of the public service is in that dense middle ground of how. So a cabinet, a government comes in with an election platform: we're going to legalize and regulate cannabis. Well, that opens up all kinds of issues and questions, from relations with the Americans to health inspection to police enforcement to whatever, and working through all of the how to get there. There's a dense set of policy and policy program issues in there, and choices to be made, along the way, and that's something that people outside government really aren't as good at. But there's a sort of comparative advantage of the public service in making things choosable at a cabinet table and implementable in practice, if that's a verb or an adjective.
Yeah. So in this area, then, your job as deputy minister for the 8 years you were at INAC was to find out, help Prentice and others determine what was doable and the how. Is that what you're telling me?
No, I think that they came in with a particular orientation, as every government would, making real emphasis on practical changes in services. Minister Prentice was very committed to establishing a new process on specific claims, because he had sat on a previous version of the Indian Claims Commission that wasn't particularly effective, and so on. He was, and there were things that were in the election platform of the government when they came in. So a lot of it was translating that into a set of memoranda to cabinet and Treasury Board submissions and regulatory things and so on. But we also gave advice on, this is what our understanding is of what's going on out there and some of the things that need attention. And that, that is another role of the public service, is to shed light on areas that aren't in the spotlight of the sort of media and social media of the day. Long-term trends, rust out issues, people that aren't being heard. And so the modern public service, to go back to your earlier question, I think has to be curious and out there and, engage with the country.
Michael, we've interviewed, the IOG's interviewed over the last 3 months, over 40 senior public service leaders across the country, federal, provincial, municipal, for a report called Top of Mind we plan to put out before Christmas. And there's a general concern coming about the politicization of decision-making and an increasing mistrust of government. If you look at the system today in Ottawa, do you think that's a cause or an effect of the growing lack of trust in government?
Well, there's a couple of issues in there. I'm not entirely sure what people mean when they say politicization. Democratic governments do the things that they put the Canadians in an election, and do the things that they think will increase their chances of being reelected. And the purpose of winning elections is to continue to be able to govern. So everything in a democracy is political in that sense. I don't have this view of a sort of sterile, apolitical universe, and then there's the dirty world of politics. Democracy, brings them together every day, and every week. So in that sense, I guess I'm challenging the sort of language. I think the critical treatment usually is around our, unelected political assistants and ministers' offices and PMO having too much influence on the outcomes or the inputs. And my view on it is I've seen it wax and wane over the years, with particular, teams and even particular individuals. I'm not convinced that it is a long wave trend, but other people may have that view. The trust issue is slightly different. There's a lot of work on trust. David Johnson wrote an excellent book on it. You can go to the Edelman Trust. All institutions these days and in pretty much every country are under some stress, whether it's big corporations, whether it's Facebook and, this week, or certainly the media, social media companies themselves, the churches. There's something going on out there way beyond, the scale of my book about trust in institutions and deference, some of which is a good thing, some of which is more engagement, more participation, less deference to authority. And some of it is corrosive because it is, as best I understand it, people feeling, well, the system doesn't listen to me and it's not governing in my interest. And I think retaining the trust that overall, the system is responsive and listens to me and is working in the long-term public interest of the country, not on behalf of special interest groups or its own entitlements, is really important. And that trust has to be earned every day, and it can be eroded very quickly.
And that isn't part of perception issue, isn't it?
Well, it can be real things, of course. Single incidents of being out of touch or disrespectful of public money or bad behaviors, in terms of harassment and bullying. They're all serious matters. There's no way to trivialize them, and they get a lot of attention and they get a lot of feedback. The fact that they do get a lot of attention, in some ways, it is for me a validation that the feedback loops and the governance holds and is fundamentally sound in Canada, because a lot of these things are detected, corrected, and there are usually consequences.
One more question before I go to the panel.
Sure.
You've described how things work, of course, in the book. Tell me, is this how they should work? Can we do better? And if so, how?
Of course, they can work better, but I want to be very clear, and I think there's even a sentence in the book. This is simply, my best description of how things work or how they've worked in my experience, and some things will change. We've been governing through Zoom calls for the last year or two. There's a lot about the how of government that will continue to evolve, and I do have a closing chapter that speculates on what's likely to remain constant and what's likely to evolve, which I commend to people, at the end of the book. We'll see. I think that what's really important about good governance is it is essentially learning software, that it's not rigid and static and clinging to, old practices and old attitudes. That it learns, and it learns from its mistakes. Government and governance will never be perfect. It will make lots of mistakes. What's really important is, does it have the kind of learning software that there's feedback and you try to do better? One of the, just a tiny example, but it's a big one, is our experience in the pandemic in 2020 and 2021 was very much shaped by having gone through SARS and H1N1 and Ebola. It was shaped by dealing with terrorist attacks and the Fort McMurray fire and developing emergency response systems, and that sort of thing. So the public health system in this country is stronger and better than it was 10 years ago. And I'm sure the lessons of this one will be internalized because there will be another pandemic. And the real art in this is ensuring that we're better prepared next time. And that continuous improvement really is an important feature of good governance. And I hope some of that comes across.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Really appreciate this.
Thanks.
Now, a reminder of the panel, the Honorable Sergio Marchi, Laurie Turnbull, and Andrew Graham. And I'm going to ask each of them to respond from their perspective. So Sergio was a minister in cabinet. He reads the book and gets advice from Mr. Wernick. So, Sergio, tell it, what's your biggest takeaway from the book that you would want us to know about? You'll have to turn on your mic. Turn on your mic, please. Thank you.
How many times have I done that? I want to thank you, first of all, Toby, for inviting me to be on your panel. And Michael, congratulations on your book. Michael touches on a lot of insights that are most relevant in his book. But if I was just to pick a single biggest takeaway, as you ask, it would be how time management is such a critical issue. And Michael repeats this throughout his book, really. And it's really a case of supply and demand. The demand on the ministers and the PM are endless. They're just nonstop bombardment. And yet the supply of time is very finite. And so politics moves incredibly fast, problems pile up, and time usually runs out. And there's also an attention span for politicians in terms of their audiences. And this has a great impact. So it's no secret that prime ministers and ministers are encouraged to focus on a few priorities rather than a long list that goes nowhere. When you make an intervention in cabinet and caucus, less is always more. Never choose to speak on every issue or else your colleagues will tune out. Pick your spots, be short, be concise. When officials brief ministers, less is more as well, not only because the minister has finite time, but is it better to give that minister 4 or 5 broad principle issues, or do you try to cram 44 facts in the minister's mind? It's important for ministers to carve out time to think and to reflect because they're constantly reacting. And so they've got to get their heads around things beyond just the 30-second clip. You've got to carve out time for your family or for exercise, which quickly gets forgotten and becomes secondary. You've got to also trust your advisors so that you can delegate widely. You can't do it alone. It's too big. It's a team sport. It takes a village. And so you have to build trust in your advisors and give them the rope that they need to do the job for you. So it is critical to understand when you become a minister how to manage your time, how to work and think under constant time pressures.
Thank you so much for that. Michael, you're nodding. Do you want to jump in quickly or? Nope. We'll get back to you, I promise you. Let me go to Laurie Turnbull, the director of the School of Public Policy at Dalhousie, who had also spent time at the Privy Council office. I'd love to get your perspective on this, Laurie.
Okay, thanks, Toby. And Michael, thank you so much for the book. It was a real pleasure to read it. I saw the book as 3 parallel conversations. So it's very personal and direct in its tone. It's talking about how government is done, and it's taking a very inside look, even though, yes, there aren't, there aren't salacious stories. There's not like the details of things that maybe some people would want to know more about. And Michael's not letting the cat out of the bag here, but it's very much like an internal lens on the types of things that affect the decisions and the behaviors of prime ministers, ministers, and deputy ministers throughout the day and throughout their terms. And so when you see these 3 conversations lined up, it gives you a really neat lens on how Westminster works. And so for me, the take home was about this sort of tension, and I hope a healthy tension, between different priorities and different realities for prime ministers versus deputies. And they're all trying to get stuff done at the same time. And definitely, Sergio is right, the time issue is really a very compelling theme in the book. But the time management relates to things like prioritization. It relates to things like, how do you play your space really well to be able to build that trust between the political side and the public service side? Some of the most really interesting reflections in the book, I think, are how deputies can use the very small amount of time they might have to be able to bend the minister's ear, to be able to work a conversation into something that becomes an action item, to know when to say something and when not to say something. So some of the really critical pieces around just being a really, top flight, intuitive public servant. You can see a lot of that when you read the piece from Michael on the deputy ministers. So yeah, I saw it as three really interesting conversations at once.
Okay, thank you. Last is Andy Graham, who was a federal assistant deputy minister before joining the Queen's faculty of, in the public admin faculty, public policy faculty, sorry, Andy. Give us your take. Microphone, have to turn on your mic.
That's Sergio's fault. I never do that. I guess in reading the book, my biggest takeaway was often what wasn't there. Okay, in spite of the title, and you've already acknowledged this in Michael and your comments with Michael. This book is about governance, and even prior to reading the Paul Wells article, I had a funny feeling that this was a little book from somebody locked in a prison in the 14th century to a prince, but and I actually kind of read it that way. Okay, the advice of somebody to those who hold power, but this is about how you make it all work, and how to take command. And there's nothing wrong, Toby, with taking command in government, because you do want to get things done, and how to serve those who command, which is, of course, the question of the deputy minister and more broadly. But as such, it bridges the political and the bureaucratic. And quite frankly, I think it struggles here. And it is also about how to carry out three key roles at the highest level in government. And each is different. I think we have to realize, and Michael does make distinctions that I think are really, really important. What I take from reading this is that knowing your place, okay, we can find better, nicer words for it, but knowing your place, okay, time, and my other colleagues have mentioned time, and I want to talk about that quite differently, and order are key to surviving. And I'm not sure that a prime minister, being prime, needs such advice. But I sure feel that the people, or the coterie of helpers around that prime minister, whoever she may be, sure do. Okay, and so that putting that kind of together is really, really important. What I take from reading this book is that there is a lot of sound, technical, and governance kind of advice here. If you take it all, you might still mess up any of the three roles. Because this is all held together, and this is my biggest takeaway, with values, judgment, and personal worth. And they have to be thought through and clear, both in the minds of those who hold them and the minds of those who serve them. And to my mind, the elusive part of this conversation is how to learn that art, to the art of leadership, the art of governance. I'm going to focus fairly more particularly in the next section on things like how to brief, how to read a room, and knowing when to decide and when to defer. And this is one takeaway gap that I think is really important, is we can talk a lot about time and how to organize and how to show up to a meeting, but can we talk about the timing of an issue, the timing of when to introduce something, the timing of when opportunity presents itself. Mm-hmm. That's probably a key value in the whole issue of effective governance at this level.
Thank you so much. Now, I committed, Michael, before I let you respond, that I would allow each of the panelists to ask you if there was any clarification they wanted from you, any particular issue they'd like you to elaborate on. Sergio, do you have anything, or did you sort of say your piece?
Yeah, a couple of things based on my experience. Michael mentions that there's no influence on the portfolio that the Prime Minister gives you. That's true and it's not true, because in my example, or my experience with Jean Chrétien, the first cabinet roles were all fixed by him. There was no debate. None of the ministers had a choice. Subsequently, those closer to the Prime Minister were given an opportunity to voice their objectives or voice their ideal cabinet role. So I can say quite openly that my second portfolio of environment and trade came actually from Jean asking me, what would you like to do? So I find that those closer to him do have some latitude, and most don't. When it comes to chiefs of staffs to ministers, being appointed directly or indirectly by the Prime Minister's office. Michael says it's a rationale to look at ministers as a group of assets. I kind of respectfully disagree. I think it's an attempt to consolidate the reach of the Prime Minister's office, and it also establishes a direct line of loyalty to the PMO and the Prime Minister rather than the minister. And I don't think that's right. Everybody's over 18 in cabinet. They have a right, I believe, to pick someone that they truly believe and have trust in. He also mentions that there should be a group of people around the Prime Minister, empower them to challenge the boss. And he's absolutely right. But it sounds good in theory, but in practice, it doesn't happen as much as it should. PMs and CEOs do live in bubbles, and especially when you have a young government like we've had since 2015, I think it's very difficult for young staffers to challenge their ministers. I think it's very difficult for young ministers to challenge a prime minister. And if they don't reach out for other advice, then it's going to lead to the kinds of mistakes that we've seen in the Trudeau administration. A young government that doesn't puncture the bubble and doesn't reach out nearly as they should. And lastly, he talks about there's no right answer to whether you bring your family to Ottawa or not. And it's right, it's true, it can be debated. But I believe that the right answer is to bring your family. First of all, they elect the MP, not the family. Secondly, the MP does have a right to tuck in their little guy or girl at night when they can during the week. And then when the MP goes home, he doesn't have to put time aside to see his family. He goes flat out, does his writing work, and comes back. And I would argue that having your family with you, when you go home at night, you basically shift gears. And having family re-energizes you for the morning after. There's nothing worse than being separated from your family and being lonely in Ottawa, and basically an excuse to probably overwork or overdrink or do other things. So I think having a family in Ottawa makes sense. Most urban ridings, people don't even know who their MPs are, let alone where their families live. A little tougher in smaller rural towns where it's closer knit and people know everything about everyone. But my recommendation when I was asked by newly elected MPs, my answer was always bring your family with you, because at the end of the day, when the phones stop, you have two things left. Hopefully your reputation and hopefully your family. And the two shouldn't be toyed with.
Thank you so much. And I'm gonna, before I give it to Laurie, I'm gonna give it to Michael. I think this, Bobby, if you just to comment, and then we'll continue, and then we're gonna get to your questions soon. So
well, there's a lot in there, and I appreciate Sergio's close reading of the book. On the family point, all I'm trying to say is it's an individual choice. I mean, there are people who have spouses who have careers and are very embedded in their community. There are people who have elderly parents that they need to be close by. Some have young children. Some have teenagers who, if you move them from their high school friends, will hate you forever. So, you have to make a decision that's right for you is really the only point I'm trying to make. There is a risk of being isolated by yourself in Ottawa for sure, but that's a small point. I also entirely agree, that you can grow in influence, and I hope that comes through a little bit. The book very much kind of has a flavor of a startup manual for a new PM and a new minister, and we keep making new ones. We've had over 60 brand new cabinet ministers in the last 10 years, and next week's shuffle could bring that to 70. So, there are always people coming into these jobs fresh, and hopefully, we can help them with the learning curve. Once you settle in, that is part of the art of being effective, is growing in the influence to change the centrist thinking about things. And you and I saw ministers, talk the prime minister into machinery of government changes and policy changes and funding changes. And that's the real power constellation. And I write about that in the book. Your influence can grow over time, and it can also fade over time. There are ministers who make a really strong start, and then they start to decline. So it is a more dynamic process, and I certainly agree the third mandate is going to be different than the second one or the first one, and so on. But the thing about the startup phase is every once in a while we have a dramatic reset, like, the annihilation of the Conservatives in 1993 and a whole bunch of new ministers coming in, or other, broad sweeping ones, where there are a lot of people coming to town who are not only new to being a cabinet minister, they've come from another walk of life. They're new to being an MP, they're new to living in Ottawa. It's a huge disruption and change. And I do spend a lot of time on that. But as the thing evolves, ministers grow in influence for sure, and they can move from the outer parts of the solar system to the inner parts, to use that metaphor, or they can move out, out to the fringes. On chiefs of staff, I know this is a controversial point. Practice has changed by different prime ministers. I would just say, when you start, you're recruiting from people that were usually working with you on the election campaign. They were party stalwarts or people that you knew who were good at winning you an election. And then they come into government, and some of them do really well and some of them don't. And I just think from the perspective of the Prime Minister's office, there's a certain amount of talent management involved. They pick up within a year or two that some chiefs of staff are underperforming, or they're letting their minister get into trouble. And I think it's reasonable for them to shuffle the team around, just as it is for the clerk to move the senior public servants around. Yes, it does create deference to the center, and I talk about that.
Okay, thank you. Laurie, your turn to put a question or a comment to Michael directly.
Sure. And yeah, I want to pick up on that piece actually on concentration of power. And I appreciate that, like, we've all learned a lot from Donnell Savoy's analysis of concentration of power, and he documents it so clearly over time. But I think sometimes and I'm definitely guilty of this, sometimes it becomes too all-encompassing. It can explain everything, and it can actually create blind spots in that we don't understand some of the nuances in the system as well. If we just sort of map on this lens that the Prime Minister and the PMO control everything and everyone just kind of follows them, and you're nobody 20 yards from the hill kind of thing. Like, I don't know that analysis, if pushed far, is really all that helpful. I would think though that I think our system is based, it requires some degree of concentration and a strong center, because if it doesn't have that, or if it doesn't work well, then you can feel it. You can feel parts of the system that are off track and things aren't coordinated as well. So I'd be interested, I guess, in a little bit more about how you've seen that evolve over the years. And I'd be specifically interested in how you've seen cabinet, like not specific ministers, but have there been changes over time in terms of the kinds of skill sets that we're looking for in ministers? Have there been prime ministers who were really trying to get a calibration, like a particular sort of cohort of ministers together, and really gave a lot of thought to how this group would work together? Or is the selection of ministers really about the individual and matching the individual to the portfolio? And then now, I guess, more about more things like gender balance and things like that. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear about your thoughts on that political center.
Yeah, there's some really big themes in there. On cabinet selection, I kind of build on Sergio's comment. The first team you pick is not the one that you're going to finish with. About half of the cabinet that I worked with in the early years of the Trudeau government was gone by the end of the first mandate, and it certainly will have turned over. So to some extent, you're sort of grooming a team, looking for who's performing, who should be moved out, who can be promoted. You're looking at your parliamentary secretaries and committee chairs and backbenchers for future development. And one of the skills of being a prime minister is sort of mindful talent development and grooming people, and so on. The media coverage tends to focus, and this isn't a criticism, but it's on what they see. So there's a lot of speculative articles that are based on gender, ethnicity, race, professional background, certainly geography, probabilities if you're from Alberta, relative to probabilities if you're from Toronto, and so on. So those demographic compositions are legitimate things for a prime minister to weigh in. What they're very, very poor predictor of is performance. Some of those people will do very well on the inside part of the job, and others will not. And you don't know, especially with a brand new group. Stephen Harper started with a group, only 3 or 4 of whom had ever been a cabinet minister, and those were in provincial governments, and so on with the Trudeau government. And I think if you went back and read the sort of articles about, who was going to be a hot property and a successful minister, some of them worked out and some of them didn't, right? So, and again, it's that having that feedback loop of constantly grooming and developing your team. And, we saw, if you're old enough, prime ministers do dramatic resets, whether it was Pierre Trudeau brought into the Pearson government with the 3 wise men. That's a historical reference, but Jean Chrétien realized he was light on Quebec ministers and brought in Stéphane Dion, Pierre Pettigrew, and Louise Robillard to the cabinet. Prime Minister Harper brought in a bunch of new talent into the 2008 and 2011 elections. So there's this kind of renewal kind of thing. My point on PMO dominance, and I push this point because nobody else does. I mean, there's no question that there's a strong direction from the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office, and we'll come back to that. But it's kind of a lazy trope. It doesn't require a lot of thought. It doesn't require a lot of analysis. It feeds people with confirmation biases. They see what they want to see. They hear what they want to hear. And it's just easier to handle a trope that, PMO tells everybody what to do, or the Prime Minister bosses the cabinet around. It's not the cabinet. I saw it, over and over and over again. It's a lively, dynamic place. I saw Jim Prentice turn around a cabinet meeting that was early in the Harper government, didn't want to do the residential schools agreement that it had inherited from the Martin government, and he talked them into it. I saw Peter MacKay, an incredibly important intervention as Minister of Justice when the Harper government was considering the anti-terrorism bill after the attack on Parliament Hill. And the room was ready to hand over all kinds of powers to the law enforcement and intelligence community. And he talked them out of it, very much against the grain of the meeting, an important role as the chief law officer of the country and so on. I give you other examples. Sergio will remember fondly Sheila Copps, squeezing $1 billion out of a very reluctant Paul Martin, and in a budget exercise and so on. So, I just have to sort of link that to Andy's comment, which is, as a deputy minister for 8 years with 4 ministers, I had very blunt conversations with ministers. When you're across the table, just you and the minister, just you, the minister, and the chief of staff. People, I gave very, very direct, blunt advice, on many occasions. And I know my colleague deputy ministers were doing the same. Because people don't see it, doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Okay, last, Andy, to you, if you have any specific to give to Michael, and then we're going to go to questions from the floor.
Well, Michael just answered my question. No, no. In fact, I actually want to ask the question because I think it's a good platform. I want to crawl inside the third part of the book, or I'm much more focused on the deputy minister thing, and not just the deputy minister thing, but the bureaucratic thing, for 2 good reasons. First of all, I spent almost half of my career working in this environment where we were briefing ministers, preparing ministers. We were governing, and we were, as Michael's pointed out, welcoming new ministers on a continuous basis, depending on where we were. And that in that I watched deputy ministers, and I watched with the greatest respect work to develop their credibility and relationship with the minister, both initially and over time. And now I'm in a situation where I'm teaching. And this is the most difficult thing in the world, I can tell you right now, in an academic environment to teach. And this is this whole issue of how do you brief, how do you provide the interface between the bureaucratic and the political, and the bureaucratic and decision makers. And I've done a lot of work in developing resources, even at our school, through our online facility called GovTalk, about how to write a briefing note, how to make a presentation, how to think, how to meet the needs, the information needs of your superiors all at the same time. And yet at the end of the day, there's an art that comes to all of this. And that, and this is where I struggle with in the reading of the book, is that we have a number of issues that we're always dealing with, and that in some are really high profile in terms of giving negative advice. Some are really low profile in terms of the mechanics of getting something done. The weakness we often see is that we provide advice on policy and bad advice on how to implement or the risks that are involved in implementing it. So the DMs have to find ways to say no, or to get to, or maybe a better way to put it, DMs have to find a way to get to know. And politicians have to separate the short-term needs from how the country is governed and the laws that make sure that the laws are respected, even those that restrain their discretion and reach. And really my question, sorry for the long introduction, is how do we establish that kind of ethic, understanding, and practice as public servants in that situation? And then how do we get to know when we have to get to know? And I mean N-O.
Yeah. No, it's really important, and I'm glad you're raising it. It's topic that other people have written on, and you can teach courses about, and I do care a great deal about. This is a thin book about tradecraft, because I don't think there are many people in the country that can write about this who've been in the cabinet room 250 times, have worked with 3 prime ministers. That's my niche. It's I'm not trying to cover all the issues around the public sector. But you raise important issues. It's important that people be driven by strong values and ethics and judgment. Absolutely. So, we want those kind of people in public life, and we would hope the selection processes, are biased towards picking the right people. And in the public service, it's important that our personnel systems, train and advance people with strong values, ethics, and judgment. No question about that. We could talk about that, a whole other seminar. And I know that's something IOG cares deeply about. But at the end of the day, I'm focusing on the role in taking decisions and moving things forward. There are a lot of conversations. I guess the other point I have to make for, particularly for this audience, is don't fall into the trap. The public service always has the truth to give the power. Sometimes advice is timid, incrementalist, based on bad information, or politically foolish. And the right relationship is a dialogue. Ministers who've come from other parts of the country and other walks of life don't live in the so-called Ottawa bubble, which I've fondly lived in for 40 years. They bring something to the table, and sometimes they know more than the public service does. They've worked in communities, they worked in businesses, they worked in, they know something, their personal experience. Every minister brings something to the table. They may be a former Afghan refugee, they may be an indigenous leader, they may have been a small businessman, they may have been a beat cop or a military officer. And I think the public service has to engage in a dialogue with the political side and be willing to be a bit humble and to take input from people that have that democratic mandate, in the decision-making process as well. So it is this kind of freshwater, saltwater mixing in the harbor, one metaphor. It's a triangle in another metaphor. And it is, where I agree with you is it's really hard. It takes constant work and attention. It has to adapt to new circumstances. But one of the things I will insist on, is that it's something Canada's pretty good at. And because we do learn and we do adapt and we do care about it, we're well served by a relatively nonpartisan system. The Biden administration still hasn't been able to appoint ambassadors. Germany had an election the week after we did, and they still haven't formed a government. So, we have a continuity, of service and support. We've had 8 elections in 21 years and kept moving forward. So, it is something that we do well. And I have to give a shout out, although it's outside my experience, but certainly, people on this panel will know. is the broader public sector, federal, provincial, municipal, indigenous governments employs 1 in 5 Canadians. And, it also is subject to a lot of the same dynamics and same forces of continuous improvement and rising expectations and so on. So it's really public governance matters. The kind of snarky feedback loop from people that have never worked inside of government, you just have to learn to shake that off and be confident. And one of the things I keep saying to public service audiences is like, it is not complacency, to say public sector management is something Canada's pretty good at. And the evidence is people from all over the world come to Canada for seminars and workshops trying to figure out how we do some of this. Obviously, we have to learn from other countries, and there's some things some countries do better. But overall, this is something that Canada should take some pride in, with a commitment to carry it on into the next century.
Thank you to all of you for moving this conversation forward. And I've committed to spending time to get questions and commentary from those of you who've joined this event. A reminder that keep those questions coming in, but we're not going to get through all of them. So they are being quote unquote moderated so that we can kind of group them and see where this takes us. One question, Michael, that's come up is the following. A few years ago, you publicly expressed deep concern for the future in a context of an increasingly toxic political and security environment. Have your concerns abated, or do they remain as strong as they did then?
I've spoken about this in several other media interviews, which you can find on my LinkedIn page, so I'll try not to repeat all of that. They have not abated, but my perspective has changed. When I was inside government, I had access to security and police reporting. I talked to ministers. I was acutely aware of the kind of vile abuse and bullying that a lot of people go through. It's homophobic, it's misogynist, it's racist, it's constant. And there is a certain, threat environment, which we saw, with the murder for the second time of an MP in Britain just a week or so ago. So, my level of concern hasn't changed. I'm watching it as an outside observer now. And one of the things I talk about in the book is you have to be very mindful of personal safety and security. It may have some bearing on the issue Sergio raised about whether your family should be in Ottawa or not, and so on. And it's not just in your Ottawa office, but now your constituency office and so on. Government politics isn't the only place this is happening, especially in cyberspace. I think it is one of the challenges of our time. And my worry would be more, the adverse selection over a period of time. Will people leave public life or not want to come in? I do know stories, I won't name names, about people were reached out to by both Team Blue and Team Red to come into politics, and they said no, thank you. So that's kind of what worries me. To go to Andy's point, you want people that are driven by idealism and values and wanting to make a difference for their country. And if they see the price of public life is too high, that's going to be unfortunate.
Toby, if I could intervene, I find that the most worrisome statement that Michael makes in his book, because it's true, is when he says the rising cost of politics. And he's right. Most cabinet ministers have sat down with potential candidates, and most of them say, no problems, I'd like to give back. No problems with the cut in salary. I've got a few dimes in the bank. But what they don't like is the kind of increasingly nasty, small-minded politics. And I think that also goes for the public servants. I mean, I recall during the Harper time, when he was quite into controlling things, that we had an exodus of very good public servants leave because it was no longer fun. So it cuts both ways. And I think this is an issue that MPs from all sides need to grapple with. What are the root causes of this nastiness? And can we get back, without being overly naive, to a kinder, gentler politics? Hugely important in terms of drafting the right people to represent us.
There are kind of two dimensions though to this, it seems to me, because Michael seems to be talking largely about outside influence, right? The kind of harassment that a McKenna would have got from social media and the like. And you're talking, Sergio, about the politicians themselves who may be driving this polarization through wedge solutions and the like. Have I got that right? Is there a
Yeah, I
distinction?
think I think it's a combination. I mean, some of the things that Maxime Bernier would speak to would be almost like inciting individuals. And I think social media is a huge issue because it almost gives a license and an anonymity of sorts for people to unload. You know, the verbal abuse was quite intensive in the last election. We had a couple of MPs who were accosted in their constituency or campaign offices. You see the divisions and the polarization in the United States, and Michael mentioned the 2 killings in the UK. So this is a general trend line. This is not just something about Canadian politics. This is about the nature and the circumstances surrounding public life the world over.
I'm going to change the topic. Obviously, we got a lot of questions on cabinet and how it works. Which is interesting because Michael, we spoke a fair amount about it during our discussion. But the question here is quite straightforward. Where are effective ministers most influential? At the cabinet table or behind the scenes? Are issues largely determined by the time they're discussed? And if so, is there anything that should be done about that? You've obviously mentioned earlier individuals who have made a difference, but so back off that one and speak maybe broadly from your experience.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and you know, I hope people will buy the book and you know, see that I try to work through this a little bit. I mean, I go back to the purpose of cabinet government is to take decisions. The time management point, you probably have about 120 hours to deal with everything that's coming in, whether it's premeditated coming out of your platform or new things happen like a pandemic or a global financial crisis or whatever. And so turning things into actionable choices, that point. So every prime minister will set up machinery of government, which is the processes of decision making, consultation, engagement, policy development, shaping and debating options, turning things into the kinds of products that ministers as individuals can deal with and then can deal with as a group. There is an art and a science to cabinet document writing and briefing, as Andy said, and so on, and distilling complexity down to the kinds of essential choices that they have to make. At the end of the day, what I try to get across, is how it feels, which is you got 3 hours and a whole bunch of issues once a week, 30 times a year, and time is extremely valuable. Being concise and being effective is important. Every minister will end up presenting as a proponent some issues and will get, either get them through or get them through modified or will be sent back, for more work. But they also have that opportunity to speak up on every other minister's initiatives, and they can add ambition or they can, throw cold water on it. They can add considerations and they can affect the outcomes. And so sometimes a little nudge, to borrow that phrase, can really change the trajectory of a conversation, and it doesn't take very much. And in other cases, a certain degree of eloquence, in making a presentation, can be really important. So whether it's your own proposals or affecting other people's proposals, there is an opportunity to make a difference. I guess what I would say is, the process will generate roughly 200 packages, decisions, a whole bunch of appointments, a whole bunch of relatively transactional things like responses to parliamentary committees and so on. And then occasionally some really big history-making choices about which way the country is going to go. And, cabinet, some of the art in cabinet is don't get bogged down in the transitional, issues, trust your due diligence processes. That's largely why there are cabinet committees. It's very basic. You can add other hours of time to work out the issues, stress test the politics, stress test the policy, and bring things to the cabinet table at a high degree of readiness and then test it, with full cabinet. So full cabinet, in my view, focuses on the bigger issues, and because of the time, you might get to do 1 or 2 per meeting, right? And so the art for PCO and PMO in particular is to make sure that flow is as good as it can be. And I use some, metaphors of plumbing and hydraulics, to try to explain that. So, but at the end of the day, you could, some issues take 2 or 3 kicks of the can. They're really hard. They're really difficult issues, and you have to work through, and both politics and policy. And some of them, they're very transactional. Everybody's happy with the due diligence. Costing's been checked. The legal things have been checked. The international relations have been checked. The political homework's been done, and they go through very, very fast. It doesn't mean they're less important, but there's an element to cabinet which is kind of a due diligence function. And a prime minister mindfully uses cabinet time effectively.
Sergio, you have to jump in there from your experience.
Yeah, there's nothing I disagree with in what Michael said, but I look at it as 2 kinds of meetings. There's the formal meetings, cabinet committee, caucus, parliamentary committees. And then there's the informal meetings where it's behind the scenes, where you're trying to talk through issues and trying to land on a consensus. And my objective, Toby, was always to try to bake as best as possible whatever issue you're baking. And for baking, you need to go to informal meetings so that by the time you get to the formal set piece, there's as much agreement on that as possible. So for me, the formal meetings, except those authentic pieces where Michael says, there's history making decisions that come to cabinet from time to time. But your formal meetings, I've always found, are as successful as what you put into baking them in the informal meeting.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Totally agree.
Toby?
Andy, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I want to throw a bureaucratic lens onto this because we, and I agree with everything, but there should be, it'd be shocking. It's a failure if anybody around the table in cabinet is surprised by a position that a particular minister's taken. Well, in terms of both, they're either briefed on the topics, or the bureaucracy has done, Michael refers to it as due diligence, and I think it's really important to emphasize this, is that the wrinkles get worked out in advance. The interests get worked out in advance, and it does have to come together. And it would be, if there were any surprise at the table, it's a failure. And as such, it's really hard, I can tell you right now, to teach this in an environment that sort of says, well, a good idea is a good idea. Well, no, there's a million good ideas all competing for each other. And how do you work them through so that the interests of other departments are taken into account? And it's not just the functional side of it, in other words, the operational side, the financial side, but how does this affect the other departments' activities? And so that the briefing that a minister gets about somebody else's cabinet submission, ideally, in the ideal world, the cabinet minister who is sponsoring it knows the position of their other colleagues in advance, and that they've been dealt with if there's a problem. It's a lot of work, and it's well worth doing. So I don't accept your question's premise, which is
that is the part the public service can know, and what the public service can't know is the political due diligence, and nor should they try to do it. So that's why I talk about the balance between the nervous system run by PMO on the political side and the public service side. I've gone to hundreds of interdepartmental meetings, and you can figure out the views of the other department and so on. I can't know that somebody's going to make an intervention at the table. This is going to cost us our seats in Nova Scotia. Or I hate that guy, I don't want to do, I don't want to help him, that sort of thing. So both are legitimate, and both come, together at the table. So the due diligence on the political side done by a minister's office, which is really Sergio's point as well. A really good minister's office is reaching out and, working with caucus, working with other ministers' offices, debugging the issues, finding out where the other person's coming from. But sometimes, stuff arrives at cabinet in a hurry, and, you just simply have to do the best you can with imperfect information, so.
One thing that can be done better, I think, Michael, at least during my time, and it goes to the point about Andrew and do you know what other ministers feel about your proposal, is that during my time, most ministers were briefed vertically. In other words, how does it affect my department? How does it affect your future? How does this play with your proposal that we're going to launch next week? And what happens is invariably the vertical briefings, everybody comes to the table with more negatives than positives. And if there was a way where deputy ministers would do a balanced briefing where there's both the vertical, but then there's the horizontal, what's the benefit for the country, the community? I think you would probably get a much more facilitating, conducive discussion at the cabinet committees, as opposed to everybody going in there with their own vertical briefing lenses and having the minister on the spot having to defend his or her proposals 10, 15 times over.
Yeah, and that's a lot of what Privy Council office does on the public service side, is give briefings to the committee chair that try to give this is where they're coming from, this is where they're coming from, here's some of the considerations. So that, the role of the ministers who chair committees is hugely important, and of course, completely out of sight to Canadians. There are ministers that are very gifted meeting chairs and others that are not so good at it.
Sorry, from PCO perspective, anything you would want to throw in? Or your experience?
Yeah, that was the fun part, is that, you do give those horizontal briefings. I think that does happen. And I think that's one of the ways that we see some of that healthy tension between the center and the line departments, because there's a kind of territory issue and you end up having really interesting chats with somebody who comes at it from a different perspective, but then you're looking at it because you've got the briefings from a bunch of different people. And so you've got more than one lens on it. So yeah, I mean, I think it happens. And I think ministers are also very curious about that. And so they're looking for it, right? Like, it's not like they don't want, just in my experience anyway, not just that kind of in-departmental briefing. They want to know what other ministers are going to say. And we can't always anticipate that, but if we can, they love it.
Can I just quickly say that, like, most important issues involve multiple ministers. It is exceedingly rare that anything would come to the table that one minister has complete carriage of. Indigenous reconciliation, climate change, what to do about China, even the practical, trade negotiations with Donald Trump, even something as relatively straightforward as cannabis legalization. You're always talking about 2, 3, 4, 5 ministers and the need to bring them together and for them to work in teams and clusters, whether they're formal or informal.
So you guys have all been, the 4 of you have been talking about how a good cabinet system works. I listened to you being interviewed by Steve Paikin this week, and he, of course, asked you a question about SNC Lavalin. But you made, I thought, a really interesting remark, which was, you said, is it possible, you essentially asked rhetorically, that all parties were acting with the best of intentions? And the implication from that is that the system didn't work, right? That it broke down because everything, quote unquote, fell apart. How did things break down? How could we have stopped that happening?
Well, I mean, it is my view. I'm not going to go into the specifics of that, but I think it is possible that people can all be, doing what they think is the right thing, and it adds up to a bad decision or a bad outcome. There's no guarantee, that the system will always function and work. The one I regret personally much more is the failure to deal with sexual misconduct and harassment in the military. That should have been caught earlier. I feel very badly about that one, and earlier interventions might have made a difference, although we're finding out just how rotted out and toxic the culture is over there, and there's a major rebuild required, but that's a topic for another day. The people can be trying to do their best with the limited information they have and the perspective they had, and how it all adds up or comes together is governance. That's right in your institute's name.
You play 3 roles as, or you did, as clerk of the Privy Council, right? Head of the Public Service, Secretary to Cabinet, Deputy Minister of the PM. Two questions. A, do you see one as being more important than the other? And second, how do you pull all three together? Because it must, period. How do you do that?
No, all three are important, and no 2 days are the same, and no 2 weeks are the same. There was a certain rhythm to Tuesdays being cabinet and Wednesdays being deputy committees and so on, that you do your best with time management, just like any other deputy minister or executive would do. And I tried to spread my time, across all three roles. My advice to deputy ministers, which is more aspiration, than that is try to spend your time on the things only deputy ministers get to do. Don't do other people's jobs, do yours, particularly your relationship with the minister, your relationship with the center, and so on. My advice to cabinet secretaries, and we've only had 23 or 24 of them, is try to do the things only clerks get to do, and that's very much about working with the prime minister and with the cabinet and trying to nudge and lead along public service of 300 distinct entities and so on. And there were all of them, just like any cabinet minister, you finish the job with all kinds of unfinished projects and ambitions and things you wish you had spent more time on in retrospect, but you live in the moment, making those choices about time and priorities. That's true for ministers, it's true for prime ministers, and it's certainly true for clerks.
When you look at those three responsibilities, Michael, many experts on government would say that over the years, being the deputy to the prime minister has gravitated to the top. Would you agree with that based on your experience?
What do you mean by to the top?
You mentioned that, that we've seen an increase in a PCO clerk making sure the prime minister is happy, and not that you don't care about cabinet or that you don't care about the public service, but keeping the boss happy seems to have gravitated to the top in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, I would quibble with keeping them happy. I mean, I sometimes made them very unhappy by telling them things that were uncomfortable or unpleasant to hear, and that's part of your job. I mean, keeping them happy is not the right way to put it. Telling them what they should hear or need to hear sometimes goes with the territory, as it does for deputy ministers, as you know. I would disagree, at least to some extent, because a lot of that, being the deputy to the prime minister role, is about cabinet, managing cabinet and managing ministers. Ministers would call me or ask to see me or meet with me because they were struggling, or they didn't know how to move something forward, or they wanted to talk, they wanted to make their case to me, thinking it would make a difference, and so on. So I had a lot of personal, candid, almost intimate conversations with the whole range of ministers over the years. Sometimes I had to go and see them and talk to them and say, look, this isn't okay with what you're doing there, mostly behavioral issues, and so on. So again, just because people don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So in a sense, helping the prime minister is helping the prime minister with all of the 7 roles that I set out in the book.
You have defined in our conversation governance largely as making sure the wheels are turning. There are broader issues around governance, of course, around the legitimacy of our institutions and trust and all that. And it does bring me to a question that was put in the chat about trust, where the individual notes that in the US, they've talked about a Department of National Unity that would help foster trust. And the question really to you is, do you think we should be doing more in Canada, as I bring you back to the earlier conversation about your concerns over trust and the nature of the pressures and the tone of political discourse?
Well, I mean, I'd have to say creating a government office of something is not automatically a solution to anything, as we all know many dead-end institutions. They have deeper issues about governance and trust in the United States that go well beyond this, the scope of this conversation. I would say that in a diverse country that is spread out over 5 time zones, that is dealing with the realities of its linguistic duality, of Indigenous reconciliation, of 20% of the people in this country were born in another country and came here. There's a lot of issues around unity, inclusion, that every government needs to be mindful of, whether it's in its political self-interest or simply the right thing to do for the country. So I spent a lot of my career on these sorts of issues, on cultural policies, about telling our stories and helping, strengthen our identity. When I was at Canadian Heritage, I worked on Indigenous reconciliation for 8 years as a deputy minister, and that's still a huge project for the country, as you know. I worked in intergovernmental affairs when we came within a hair's breadth of losing the country, 52,000 votes in the 1995 referendum, and we'd be talking about partition today. So, unity and inclusion is part of, good government. There's things that require political leadership, and there are things that the institutions of public government can do as well.
When you were clerk, you were driving for an inclusive, more agile and more equipped public service. Do you really think that's enough to modernize the public service to meet the challenges of today?
Well, I think those are it's a typology which masks a whole bunch of issues underneath it. I would say, and I've written about this in other fora, that the government has to make a choice soon about whether it wants to take on a more profound structural reform of the public sector. There are lessons from the pandemic for all kinds of public institutions. Universities have had to change, hospitals have had to change, school boards have had to change, courts have had to change, and certainly the federal public service does as well. But we're kind of, use another tortured metaphor, we're trying to get MacBook Pro performance out of 1990s Windows software. Like, the basic legal underpinnings of the public service haven't really changed. It's still a box by box job model. We still have over 600 classification levels. The staffing processes are still not as nimble as they should be. The employment equity legislation is completely out of date and needs a rewrite. Proactive disclosure needs a rewrite. So, it's easy to have sort of slogans and statements about where we want to get, but this hard work in the dense middle of what does this mean for IT policies and HR policies, and ultimately, I think some of the core legislation needs a fresh look.
Michael, we're just about out of time. Let me ask you, was there anything in this book you wanted to say but felt that you couldn't?
No, I mean, it's been interesting to go through the feedback loop of the interviews and how people have perceived it, and I'm happy to get more as the book actually hits bookstore shelves over the next little while. I think in retrospect, if I did a second edition, I would emphasize some things more and make some adjustments. Even today's discussion sort of shows that. But I didn't want to write a memoir. I didn't want to look at my stories kind of approach to these things. I tried second person direct, and to try to make it as accessible as possible. I wrote the book for undergraduate political science and public management students. I talked to Laurie about this very early in the process, is the need for some works by practitioners to complement what's out there. And that was really the primary audience. But if there are people that are interested in politics and government and the unique Canadian variant, public servants would be one, but diplomats, lobbyists, political staffers, brand new MPs and so on. That's great. I hope it has a little bit of a shelf life over the next little while.
When you had left your post as clerk, you had suggested, and I quote you here, you might have more to say later. So can we expect more then? Are you predicting another book or simply a rewrite of this one?
It's a demand and supply issue. But I'm happy to focus on getting this one safely out and getting it into shelves and into classrooms over the next little while. That'll do plenty for now.
Well, fair enough. So look, we're at the end of our time. I want to say thank you to the panel, Sergio Marchi, Laurie Turnbull, and Andy Graham. I obviously have to say a very special thank you to Michael. It has been a real honor to have you and, of course, the rest of the panel on to talk about your book. I need to say thank you to my team who makes this happen, Lynn Ricard, Stephen Van Dyne, and Chris Day. I am, of course, nothing more than a pretty face. I appreciate your time, everyone who joined us. I hope you found this valuable. It will be on our IOG YouTube channel, and I encourage you to visit our website, iog.ca, for any of our courses and programs that you might find useful. So once again, thank you all. Thank you to Michael, Laurie, Andy, Sergio. It's been a real pleasure to have the four of you and to have all the rest of you join us. I will let you go. Take care.
Thanks.
Take care.
Merci.
Thank you.
Good reach.